Today we're going to talk about the death penalty. We're going to talk about it in the next couple of classes, talk about the history, other countries, talk about a little bit about the appellate process, different methods of execution, and some case studies. So when we're talking about the history, it goes back to the Code of King Hammurabi of Babylon, 18th century BC. This is kind of the first recorded codes that we know about. It's a collection of 282 rules, established standards for commercial interaction, set fines and punishment to meet the required sum of justice. It's basically an eye for an eye society. You do something to somebody, it's going to come back at you. And many of the punishments were pretty harsh, removing the guilty's part of tongue, hands, breast, eye or rear, cutting off, knocking out teeth. An early example of an accused person being considered innocent until proven guilty. So at least it looks like they did have a little bit of due process. There was they didn't carry out any of these punishments until there was some type of due process. Examples: if one was caught committing robbery, put to death. Son of a prostitute says to adopted mother, father, you're not my mother, father. His tongue would be cut out. Son strikes his father, his hand would be hewn off, which meant cut off. Man knocks out the teeth of his equal, his teeth shall be knocked out. So then the next recorded was the Hittite Code in the 14th century BC, and they basically did away with the death penalty, and they mostly enslavement, like prisoners. The Draconian Code of Athens was pretty bad. The 17th century, death for almost everything, and then there's some sources that say it was written in blood rather than ink, the death sentences, and that's where we get the word draconian. And you guys are young, you might not know it, but draconian means old and creepy, and you can look it up. Anyway. Then next we get the Roman Law of the 12 Tables, which is 5th century BC. This is when Rome was growing. Rome wanted to establish laws for the citizens, and so they just had 8 forms of punishment: fines, flogging, retaliation in kind. Again, go back to the eye to eye, like the Code of King Hammurabi had. Banishment, civil disgrace, slavery, put in leg chains, and they did have the death penalty. We'll get ours is from England. So let's look at a little bit of England. 10th century death penalty were hangings. They were very popular for a while, really until we started the country here. But you did have reprieve. William the Conqueror in the 11th century decided there would be no executions except in times of war. Again, you've got treason. And so then you get to 16th century, and actually it's not Henry VII, it's Henry VIII. He was a very interesting king. You probably heard Henry VIII, I Am, the song, had 6 wives. He beheaded them. He killed a lot of people for religious reasons. So let's see, some of his methods were bullying, burning the state, hanging, beheading, drawing and quartering, which you've seen the movie, you know what drawing and quartering is, a pretty gruesome death. Various capital offenses included marrying Jew, you could be put to death, not confessing to a crime, and treason. In 1700s, there were over 200 offenses that faced the death penalty, not just first-degree murder. So there's a big reform in the early 1800s, which severely cut the capital offenses, which capital offenses is death penalty cases. So we were influenced by Britain, and over here in the U.S., the first recorded execution was Captain George Kendall in Jamestown. He was executed by a firing squad for being a spy for Spain. Firing squads was common in the military. And then the next one was 1612. Virginia Governor Thomas Dale enacted the divine, moral, and martial laws. So this governor decided that in Virginia, the death penalty could be for even minor offenses such as stealing grapes, killing chickens, or trading with the Indians. And the death penalty laws varied from colony to colony. It was kind of like state to state. The colonies made their own laws, and there was no consistency in them. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, I'll go up north from Virginia, had its first execution in 1630. And then New York, Duke's Law in 1665, under these laws, offenses such as striking one's mother or father or denying a true God were punishable by death. A little easier on kids these days. We've talked about that. In 1794, Pennsylvania repealed the death penalty for all offenses except first-degree murder, and so that's pretty much what the first state that did that. And then you've got the Jacksonian era, and people were calling to abolish the death penalty. You're going to watch a video next week that's going to show about hanging. We're going to talk about that in the next thing. heads would fall off, eyes would pop out. Basically the public was losing interest in it. So capital crimes were reduced, but state penitentiaries were built at that time. So Pennsylvania became the first state to move executions into correctional facilities and out of the public eye, so it wouldn't be such a shocking thing. So the reform did cut capital cases, but most kept the death penalty until the 1950s. As far as the death penalty, what anti-death penalty proponents talk about, the Bill of Rights in 1789, remember the 1600s, where we didn't have a constitution, we didn't have a Bill of Rights, everything was from England. But the Bill of Rights included the Eighth Amendment, which prohibited cruel and unusual punishment. Then we also had the Fifth Amendment, language implying possible use of the death penalty, requiring a grand jury indictment for a capital crime, and due process of law for deprivation of life by the government. Anyway, there's your due process clause. The grand jury, you had to have you give your evidence to somebody. They say, well, there's enough evidence to go forward to trial. Then you have your due process trial for a capital crime. So you have to be given due process before you can be deprived of your life. Again, that's the federal government. States, 14th Amendment requires due process. According to certain statistics, and it depends on what you read, up until 1991, supposedly 15,000, little over 15,000 people were executed. Another statistic I found was between 1930 and 2002, almost 5,000 executions in the U.S. 3 states abolished the death penalty for murder during the 19th century pretty early. Michigan in 1847, Wisconsin in 1853, and Maine in 1887. And Michigan actually never carried out a death sentence on anybody. However, in 1972, 43 states still had the death penalty, 7 did not. Military and federal government both had the death penalty. So we come to 1972, and there were a number of cases that were combined in the case of Furman versus Georgia, and they were all deciding the same thing. It went to the Supreme Court. What happened in Furman versus Georgia? And some of you have this. A resident awoke in the night to find William Henry Furman committing burglary. Now, at the trial, in an unsworn statement, Furman said his gun fired accidentally, killing the victim. The key word there is unsworn statement. This is sometimes common, sometimes not. It's used a lot in sentencing cases. I use it a lot with my clients in sentencing cases. So basically, you're not swearing to it, that it's the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. The prosecution can't cross-examine you on anything you say. So it really is kind of a self-serving statement that cannot be challenged. It can be talked about during closing argument, but cannot really be challenged. So it really doesn't carry much weight, especially since he already had a prior statement that he turned in that he'd fired the shot blindly while fleeing, killing the individual. The shooting occurred during the commission of the felony. The felony was burglary. So under the Georgia law, be eligible for the death penalty and the felony murder rule, and he was given the sentence of death. Now, in this case, the procedure was the jury was asked to return a verdict of guilt or innocent and simultaneously determine whether the defendant would be punished by death or life in prison. So a juror would get up and say, we find you guilty of first-degree murder and we sentence you to death. The Supreme Court basically said all these, by split decision, struck down the death penalty because they said it was unconstitutional as applied in an arbitrary and discriminating manner. This was given too much power to this jury to determine both. And there are all the cases that were combined. I mean, one was a rape case. So somebody was on death penalty for a rape case. All really had to do with juries. What power are you going to give the jury? What information you give a jury? Can a person sit on a jury that doesn't believe in the death penalty? Can a person sit on the jury just has certain reservations? So anyway, they were all put together. The Supreme Court in a split decision decided that it was arbitrary, that they really needed some consistency before you're going to actually put somebody to death. However, they did not say that the death penalty was per se unconstitutional. So they said it could violate the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment if not imposed fairly. So a brief moratorium was posed on the death penalty for state and federal lawmakers to refine the criminal statute to ensure that capital punishment would not be neither arbitrary or discriminatory. And for the next 4 years, states started scrambling and they would send things up and the Supreme Court say, no, this doesn't cut it yet. So because the statutes were invalid, that all the death sentences imposed under the state statutes were invalid. All death sentences were commuted. They were all reduced to life imprisonment. Said it would be cruel and unusual if it was too severe for the crime. Again, we talked about arbitrary, and it violated the 8th Amendment. It voided 40 death penalty, commuted sentence of 629 death row inmates. So if you were on death row before that time, you were now life in prison. After that time, you weren't so lucky. Because 4 years later, a case finally made it to the Supreme Court under a new death penalty statute in Georgia. Troy Leon Gregg was found guilty of 2 counts of murder and armed robbery. Not a nice guy. He had a life of crime in and out of prison. He asked victims for a ride, wanted to rob them, so he killed them, then robbed them. He's given the death penalty. Now, what's next is you really can't come up with this stuff. You can't write the stuff. He escaped from death row the night before he was put to death. Now, remember, this is in the early, 70s, so I have no idea how a person could escape, but he did. First death row escapee, was not the last. And here's the kicker. He was murdered in a bar fight in North Carolina hours after his escape. So he actually shortened the time that he was going to be put to death. So the Georgia procedure, the U.S. Supreme Court said that was fine because the trial was bifurcated, and bifurcated means split in 2. You have a guilt and innocent phase, and you have a sentencing phase. And if you hear, you hear such and such, John Adams was found guilty of, blowing up the house. We're going to meet in 2 or 3 months. They set a date for sentencing. In the military, I didn't have that. In the military, we basically prepared our sentencing case along with our trial case. And normally we would be given a short recess after a person was found guilty and going into the sentencing case. Now, if it was a long case, if it was a murder case or something like that, we were usually given the night or the rest of the day off to get everything together and make sure we had all of our witnesses there. But the military was a very quick process. It didn't take away any of the rights. As an attorneys, we knew we had to prepare for that. The first proceeding, the jury decides defendant's guilt. You're guilty of first-degree murder. No first-degree murder, no death penalty. Second hearing, which comes later, the jury determines whether certain statutory aggravating factors exist or mitigating factors exist to determine if death or life imprisonment. So what do we mean by aggravating and mitigating factors? Probably just what they said. Aggravating factors, things that show the offender's bad side and that the offender should be put to death. Then again, it's like lack of remorse, amount of harm to the victim, committing crime in front of a child, goes to the facts of the case, how many, use or threat of abuse of violence, multiple sex acts, repeated offense, were you just released from prison on the same offense, age and mental state of the victim, permanent injuries of the victim, and by we mean that, these kids no longer have their mother, or these children no longer have their father, the wage earner, anything that shows something bad. Mitigating factors, things that show the offender's good side. And this is what I did when I started with any of my defendants. And we were going to trial, give me all the letters you've got. Did you, in school, do you have a favorite teacher that liked you? Maybe you have a rabbi or a priest or somebody who can say, nice things about you. Did you volunteer? Did you get any awards? But mitigating factors are, this is the first time they've been up. They don't have a criminal record. They played a minor role. Mental physical illness, genuine remorse is huge. Any volunteer activities, any way you've made a difference in the community and might be able to make a difference. So Indiana capital offenses, breaking it down. These are the current men on death row in Indiana. You'll be seeing a video this week. There is one woman. So capital punishment, you can get the death penalty for intentional murder while committing or attempting to commit arson, burglary, child molestation, criminal deviant conduct, kidnapping, rape, robbery, carjacking, criminal gang activity, dealing in cocaine. So felony murder means you commit murder while committing one of these felonies. Unlawful detonation of explosive with intent to injure, lying in wait, hiring out hard to kill. If you hire somebody to kill, they kill. It's just like you killed them. Victim was law enforcement officer. You had another conviction of murder prior to this one. You were in a sense of life imprisonment at the time, which means you killed somebody in prison, you killed a guard, you killed another prisoner, or you escaped and killed somebody. Dismembered the victim. The victim was less than 12 years old. That's a big one. And we'll talk about the federal prisoners. Victim was witness against defendant. has committed another murder at any time, regardless of whether convicted, committed murder by firing into an inhabited dwelling or from a vehicle, just random shooting. Victim murder was pregnant, murder resulted in intentional killing of viable fetus. Remember, these are all Indiana laws where you can get the capital punishment. Victim was burned, mutilated, or tortured while victim was alive. So, again, 1976, death penalty came back. Executions resumed on January 17, 1977, and Gary Gilmore went before a firing squad in Utah. We'll talk about the different states and the different methods of execution in the next lecture. Between 1970 and 1980s, only 10 people were executed, but after that time, capital punishment soared, because just because Georgia had a state law doesn't mean the others had a state law. Each one of them that went to the U.S. had to abide by what the Supreme Court found. So I think I've said it before, 1,500 people have been executed as of July 20. That doesn't count the 7 federal prisoners that were executed since July. Here's a good map of, you can see the death penalty. The red states have the death penalty. Most of them, and it's sunshine, most of the active ones are in the South. The blue ones have done away with the death penalty, and the purple ones actually have the death penalty on the books, but the governor of the state at the time has put a moratorium on it, which means under their reign as governor, there'll be no executions. If another governor comes in, they could lift it. Probably not going to happen in these 2 states. So states with the death penalty is currently 28. And then you also have the federal and the military. Indiana does have the death penalty, we just read. These 3 states, Oregon, Pennsylvania, California, have a moratorium right now. And these are the states with no death penalty. And you can see the dates when the legislature decided to end the death penalty. A lot of them are pretty recent. These are actually within the last couple of years. So be interesting to see what happens in the next few years. Though some states are pretty dug in and keeping the death penalty. Average time on death row. In the 18th century is 2 days. Not a whole lot of time to plead your case or come up with anything that would prove your innocence. In 1940s and 50s, it was a couple months. So at least you had some appeal time. But after 1976, when the death penalty was reintroduced, the whole appeals process was overhauled, and this is for the protection so you don't put an innocent man to death. And as of to date, there has been no proof that anybody innocent has been put to death, though you cannot say for an absolute certainty that an innocent person has not been put to death. Procedural safeguards were implemented, such as an automatic appeals to the state Supreme Court. Anytime somebody's found guilty, appeal is automatic. Post-conviction reviews and appeals have resulted in longer and longer stays on death row. And then, of course, a few years back, challenges to lethal injection procedure. They said it was cruel and unusual, and the countries that were giving us the mixture for them would no longer give them to us. And so there was a hiatus for a while because none of the states could get the lethal injection. So prior to 1864, 6 years and 2 months. Then we get up to 2013, and it's 15 years and 5 months. 2019, it's averages over 16 years, many over 20, 25, a long time. That doesn't count those that have been reduced to life, which it took that some were in death row over 25 years before that happened. Sometimes the sentence was overturned or the prisoner died. So about 1/4 of those on death row have been executed. And our big one here is the Federal Correction Complex in Terre Haute. That's where all federal prisoners on death row are executed. As an example of the time it takes to do an appeal, so like the California case of Jones versus Chappell. And this isn't for every case, but it's pretty typical. State appoints a lawyer to represent the condemned. The lawyer must have a minimum number of years experience handling felony cases and be willing to work for very low pay. And an experienced attorney who's probably making a lot more money now, so that takes a while to find. It could take 3 to 5 years. Sometimes you can find them a lot quicker than that. But you have to find somebody willing to take it. And during that time, of course, the person sits on death row because he's got a right to an appeal, can't do anything until they've had that appeal. Sometimes it takes a little while for the lawyer to get familiar with the case, not making money, not a top priority before they file a case in a case brief. And the Supreme Court would schedule a hearing for another couple of years, and then they won't issue an opinion for another few months after that. Supreme Court, if they uphold the verdict and sentence, the inmate would almost surely file a writ alleging newly discovered evidence or incompetent assistance, incompetence of counsel, or both. A lot of times, incompetence of counsel is just kind of like a Hail Mary thing. When I was doing defense, a number of my friends got ineffective assistance of counsel complaints against them, and none of them were affirmed, but it was just somebody was pissed off because they didn't like their sentence. I gave my clients a whole lot of TLC, and thankfully I never had an answer for one of those. So then the defendant, if that happens, defendant, and sometimes a lawyer decides they don't like the death penalty and say, okay, I screwed up, you know. There are state bar repercussions, though, if you do that. So that's not really a good thing to do. The defendant's entitled to a new lawyer if he asks for one. More time passes while the state looks for a lawyer. Usually takes 70 years to go through the state system. And then guess what? You file a writ and you go through the federal system, which could take up to 10 years. So about a quarter of a century of court reviews. And in the meantime, the person sits on death row. And guess who's paying for all this? The taxpayer. We are paying tons and tons of money for all these appeals. So here's a little diagram. Local DA decides whether to stick the death penalty. In a lot of cases, they decide not to because there's only so much money they have in some of these small town budgets, and guess who has to pay? So then the state trial, the jury decides that somebody deserves to go to the death sentence. Then you go to a criminal court of appeals, and they review the record. And then if they say no, the death penalty is good, then it goes to the Tennessee Supreme Court. If they say no, it's good, then you follow it to the Supreme Court. They decide to rather review the records of the court proceedings. Then if they find something, it might go back to state court for post-conviction relief based on the questions that were raised originally. Then again, you go to the Court of the Criminal Appeals. And this is Tennessee because this is the one that I had cases before I went in the military. Then you go to the Tennessee Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court, and based on what the U.S. Supreme Court finds, you can go back to the Federal District Court, and then you start the process all over again to the Federal Court. You go to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals and the U.S. Supreme Court, and if after all that happened and all those years have gone and all that money has been expended, then you ask for the government for an executive clemency. And it's given. Sometimes it is given. Sometimes it is not. And here's kind of a good little diagram to show the appellate process. And this is in 1950, Nebraska. Okay, you have almost 1842 murders, not all first-degree capital offenses. So then you find that you have 281 first-degree murder convictions. Maybe some have aggregate, and maybe some have mitigating factors. Maybe some are in small towns that can't afford the death penalty. You look at those, then 119 death penalty sought. And of those that were sought, the verdict actually came back 33 death sentences. So then you come down here, you've got 30 on death row, 10 in appeal process or lingering, 6 died in prison waiting, 13 sentences reduced by the court, and 1 sentence actually vacated. So you're down to 3 executions. So you've got all that money, time spent, all those attorneys paid for, and all this. And we'll look at some case studies, and it's still a personal thing whether you decide that we should or should not have the death penalty. Death row. According to the Criminal Justice Project, there are approximately 2,620 people on death row. That was as of January 1st, 2020. We've talked about that. At 7 federal inmates have been executed since July 1st. And I don't know if you guys have watched the news or anything. This has been on the local news in town because Terre Haute is where the federal prison executions take place, and it is right down the road, not very far. You can see it from the interstate. It looks pretty grim. Nearly a quarter of the inmates on death row die of natural causes while awaiting execution. And here, you can go online and look to see. These are the federal prisoners that have been executed since July, and they've all been by lethal injection. You can also go on and see what they did, who they killed. These are convictions in 2020. Texas is probably the #1 on death penalty cases. There was one from Tennessee that we were watching last year. If you're curious, you can find most of this online. So let's see if I can play this clip, if it will work.
Justice Department announced today that the government will start executing death row inmates again for the first time in 16 years. Chief Justice correspondent Jeff Pegues tells us the first to die will be 5 inmates convicted of the murder, torture, and rape of children. It's a selection process some have called evil first.
Daniel Lewis Lee, a white supremacist, was convicted in 1999 of murdering a family of 3, including an 8-year-old girl. Today, the Department of Justice said Lee and 4 other men would be put to death in December and January, the first executions under the federal death penalty since 2003. President Trump has long said that he wanted to revive the federal death penalty, including after 11 people were shot and killed in a Pittsburgh synagogue last year.
People that do this, you have to bring back the death penalty. This is the worst form of terror.
One reason for the federal moratorium was concerns the 3-drug cocktail administered during lethal injections was leading to botched executions.
His upper body lifted off the bed, his head lifted off the pillow.
The Justice Department said today that it would use a single drug, pentobarbital, going forward. 29 states still allow the death penalty. One study found that since 1973, 166 people on death row have been exonerated.
There have been 1,500 executions, which means that for every 9 executions, there's been one person wrongly convicted, wrongly sentenced to death, and exonerated.
The DOJ says all 5 men have exhausted their legal appeals. Historically, this is significant because just 3 federal inmates have been executed in the past half-century, including Timothy McVeigh in 2001. Nora.
Really a stunning turn of events. Jeff Pegues, thank you so much.
Okay. We'll go back to, okay. So this is a little bit more showing about the federal prisoners and that were recently executed. That was not a political ad or anything. It was just a little clip talking about the death of federal prisoners. And over here, you can see what they did. I mean, one of them carjacked 63-year-old woman, 9-year-old daughter, drove around, slit the 9-year-old daughter's throat. I mean, this is not really great stories over here. And if you read them, some of them are really pretty bad. Now let's look at the length of death row and look at some of them who've been there. Reaching the 3rd spot, 36 years, was Lawrence Bittaker. Really not a good guy. His with his accomplice raped, tortured, and murdered 5 teenage girls over a period of several months in 1979. Both of these guys, bad guys, in and out of prison. They met in prison and soon came up with a plan to murder a teenage girl of every year from the ages of 13 to 19. Yeah, really nice guys. So 4 months period in 1979, they picked up 20 female hitchhikers. This was just a trial run. Did not assault any of them, just to decide how easy it was going to be to execute their plan. This was Bittaker, this was Norris, and these are the 5 girls ages 13 to 19 who they murdered. They murdered their first victim on June 24th, 1979. It was this one right here. She was 16 years old. She didn't want to get in the van. They got her in the van. They took her. They both raped her. She asked if she was going to die. And she asked to say a prayer, you know, before they killed her. And they proceeded to strangle her. She was the first of 5 victims. And with the final girl murdered on October 31st, they became known as the Toolbox Killers because the items they used to torture and kill victims were found in the household toolbox, including ice picks, vice grips, and a sledgehammer. And the torture, Bittaker was apparently high IQ, but apparently the torture got worse because by the time they got to the 5th one, she had so many injuries. I mean, they were beating her chest, they were doing a pickaxe at her arm, breaking her arm. They put vice grip. Anyway, it's really, you can read it. It's really quite horrible. Don't really want to talk any more about it, but the torture got worse and worse on these poor innocent girls. They were found guilty and received the death sentence, and Norris wasn't. Norris turned on Bittaker so he could get life without parole. And then Bittaker, it's a little like you, proceeded to file lawsuit after lawsuit, complained about receiving crushed sandwiches and broken cookies and suggesting they are examples of cruel and unusual punishment. One of the reasons the Reform Act was established, the PLRA, also claimed he is afraid of death and it appears he will die in San Quentin cell as there's no plan to execute him anytime soon. And actually all those two guys, recently both of them died in jail within about a month of each other. Second longest person on death row. So anyway, just going back to this person so you can decide whether this person deserved death row. So second longest person is Gary Alford, death row for strangling to death 3 women, a grandmother, mother, and a daughter. Again, you've got a child involved in there. Actually raped the mother. And after 40 years, died of natural causes. Thing about it is he was found to have mental illness. He was actually put in a mental illness hospital and then got out and then committed these murders. He was sent, 75 others were put to death and bypassed him. He was sent to a psychiatric hospital and doctors wouldn't treat him. Anybody know why doctors wouldn't treat him? The oath that they take, because what happens? If they treated him and he got better, then they would send him back and he would be put to death. So the dilemma, make him well to kill him. So still that dilemma is with doctors now, and that's why a doctor won't administer the lethal injection. So what is the argument here about death row? Died from a brain tumor in 2013. Raymond Riles is let's see, let's go to third one. Raymond Riles was 41 years on death row. Don't know what happened to his picture. He was convicted of murdering John Henry in 1974. Shot him, stood over him while he was bleeding out, demanded money, tried to apply for a job at a food store. When they wouldn't give him the application, they robbed him. They got a police car, chased him down, crashed him into a tree and opened fire on police. He was sentenced to death. He actually wanted to go forego the appeals and accept execution. Again, this is another one because of mental illness. He probably will never be executed, even though he wants to be. And remember, there's always a victim. When somebody's on death row, that's an aggravating. Manuel Valle has been on death row for 33 years for killing a police officer. And one of the videos you watched on the death penalty, you'll see the guy that killed him. He got married, doesn't think he's ever going to get out of jail because of it. One Supreme Court just stated amount of time was cruel and unusual. So what's the issue in this case? There's a family without a father, a senseless killing of an officer. Again, these are things that if you want to make change, then you got to think about both sides of the case. How many countries are in the world? Well, approximately 195. How many have the death penalty? Approximately 53. And as far as a rule of view, here's what you could see. Again, the red is where they have the death penalty, US. Few countries, a lot of the Middle Eastern countries have it. The ones in the blue are surrounding country borders, the one that have abolished it. These say they have it, but they really don't use it. So it's kind of a mixture. And we'll talk about the methods next week. Hanging, firing squad, electrocution gas, lethal injection. Hanging is in 60 countries. That's probably very popular. Firing squad in Asia. Communist countries still shoot in the back of the head. Saudi Arabia still practices beheading. We've got starvation, Islamic pushing homosexuals off high buildings or towers. Forced suicide, honor killings are in Turkey. And those are what the World Organization is really, really trying to stop. And stoning, you can stone under Sharia law. And it's really, really kind of, especially for our culture, this is a very crude, any culture it would be. Dig a hole, put one in there and throw rocks at the head. Hopefully one hits you soon so you don't keep getting pounded. This has been popular through the ages in certain countries. You can get the death penalty in other countries for apostasy, which means leaving a religious faith, blasphemy, practicing Christianity in some countries, drug trafficking, drug dealing, drug possession. This is especially big in Asian countries and Philippines, Taiwan, Indonesia, because drugs have become such a problem and has really put a strain on the economy. And so political unrest, rape, kidnapping, terrorism, treason, espionage, adultery, sodomy, bestiality. This still exists. There's been cases recently about men Having sex with their farm animals, in case you don't know what this is, it's having sex with animals. Corruption, alcohol, aggravated robbery, witchcraft, sorcery, arson, dictator that doesn't like you. Think North Korea or some other countries too. In China, they don't know because China won't give actual figures, but they think there's about $4,000 a year executed, but the amount remains still unknown. Of course, we have no idea about North Korea. In Saudi Arabia, they do have a chop shop square in Riyadh, and that's actually somebody being beheaded in the square. They chop off ears, they chop off hands there, still in practice today. If you have enough money, they will take you to the hospital and have it surgically amputated if you've been found guilty of something. As a matter of fact, some of them have come to the United States, and just physicians here have given them a fake hand. But that's actually, Amnesty International recorded 652 executions in 20 countries in 2019. Most were in China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Egypt. Again, we don't know about North Korea. China remained the world's leading executioner, but we still don't know about it. I believe thousands of executions have been carried out. And that ends this lecture. Next time we'll go into case studies and talk about ways that we impose the death penalty.